There's a conversation that happens at midlife that sounds like this. I keep talking about wanting to change, but I never actually do anything about it. And then there's this pause, this moment of self judgment, like the gap between what you say you want and what you're doing is evidence of weakness, lack of discipline, or some character flaw you haven't fixed yet. But what if that gap isn't a problem to solve? What if it's information? Because I've noticed something in working with people navigating midlife transitions. Sometimes the gap between aspiration and action is psychological. You're avoiding something you're not ready to face. But increasingly, especially right now, the gap is telling you something different. The world you're trying to navigate has fundamentally shifted, and your aspirations were built for conditions that no longer exist. Let me show you what I mean. I have a friend who talks about becoming a snowbird every winter. This conversation comes up like clockwork, usually midway through the winter when the days are short, but the nights are so much longer. And that depth of darkness makes people want to head south on vacation. And for years, I listened to this as aspirational talk, the kind of planning that feels productive, but never moves forward. This year, sitting with that conversation again, I started hearing it differently. She'd need a job that pays significantly more. At 58, in a market where ageism is increasingly undeniable, she'd need skills that take time to develop. Time she doesn't have after exhausting days at a job that's already depleting her. She'd need financial flexibility while watching inflation erode savings faster than she can build them. And suddenly I realized this isn't avoidance. This is her psyche processing the gap between what she hoped midlife would look like and what it actually looks like. The aspirational talk isn't keeping her stuck. It's how she's staying sane while reality catches up. Here's what makes midlife different right now. In this specific moment we're living through, previous generations of midlife adults could reasonably assume if you worked hard enough, if you were strategic enough, if you aligned your values and built better systems, you could restructure your life toward what mattered. And that's still true for some people, but it's becoming less true for more people. And the self-help industrial complex hasn't caught up yet. So we're still being sold frameworks that say, if you're not creating the change you want, you're avoiding something. And sometimes that's accurate. Sometimes you are using aspirational talk as emotion regulation. Sometimes you do need to examine whether you're mistaking planning for progress. But sometimes the gap between aspiration and action is telling you the doors you thought would stay open are closing or closed. The resources you thought you'd have aren't available. The timeline you imagined doesn't account for how exhausted you actually are. And that's not a character flaw, that's information. So, how do you know which kind of gap you're dealing with? Here's what I've started asking, both in my own life and in conversations with people navigating this territory. When I imagine taking action on this aspiration, what stops me? And then I listen for two different kinds of answers. Psychological answers sound like, I'm afraid of failing, I'm not sure I deserve it, I'm worried about what people will think, I don't know if I'm ready. Those are internal. Those are about your relationship with yourself, with risk, and with identity. Those can be worked with. Material answers sound different. I can't afford the pay cut. I don't have the energy after managing my chronic condition. I'm supporting aging parents and can't reduce income. I'm paying for college tuition and can't take on more risk right now. Or The industry I wanted to enter isn't hiring people my age. The cost of retraining is beyond what I can access. Those are external. Those are about systems, resources, infrastructure. Those require different strategies entirely. And here's what's tricky. They often exist simultaneously. You might have both psychological resistance and material constraints. But if you're only addressing the psychological part, if you're only working on your mindset and your alignment while ignoring the material reality, you're going to keep feeling like you're failing because you're using the wrong diagnostic framework. If this is landing for you, give the video a like. It helps others find their way here and realize they're not alone. Here's the other thing I want to name, and this is where compassion becomes really important. Sometimes midlife aspirational talk isn't about avoiding action. It's about processing grief. You thought you'd write a book by now. You thought you'd change careers. You thought you'd have financial freedom to make different choices. You thought you'd have more energy, more time, more options. And you're discovering some of those doors have closed. Not because you failed, not because you didn't work hard enough, but because timing, circumstances, systemic barriers, help, caregiving responsibilities, economic realities didn't align the way you needed them to. And aspirational talk becomes this liminal space where you're neither fully pursuing the dream nor fully letting it go. You're somewhere in between, holding it loosely, talking about it annually, keeping it alive enough that you don't have to grieve it yet. And I don't think that's pathological. I think that's human. I think that's how we slowly adjust to futures we didn't choose, but have to find our way through anyway. So, if you're someone who talks about change more than you create it, here's what I'm sitting with. First, get honest about which kind of gap you're dealing with. Is this psychological resistance that integrity work can address? Or is this material constraint that requires different strategies, collective action, resource access, and accepting limitations you didn't choose? Second, stop letting self-help culture gaslight you into thinking everything is figure-outable through the right mindset. Some things aren't. Some doors close. Some timelines don't work out. And acknowledging that isn't giving up. It's being honest about what you're actually navigating. Third, if you're processing grief about an aspiration that's no longer viable, let yourself process that. You don't have to immediately pivot to gratitude or silver linings. You can just acknowledge, I wanted something different than this, and that loss is real. And fourth, ask yourself what you're actually seeking underneath the aspiration. Because sometimes when the original path closes, there are adjacent paths that might still be available. My friend who wants to be a snowbird, maybe that's really about wanting relief from seasonal depression. And maybe that can't happen through geographic relocation right now. But maybe there are smaller interventions, light therapy, vitamin D, restructuring winter routines that address the actual need without requiring the full transformation she can't currently access. Maybe the aspiration was pointing towards something true, even if the specific solution isn't available. Here's what I want to offer you. Permission to stop pretending your stuckness is only psychological when material reality is a factor. Permission to grieve timelines that didn't work out without immediately having to find the lesson or the growth opportunity. Permission to acknowledge that some aspirations served their purpose. They kept you company. They gave you hope during difficult seasons. And now they need to be released. Not because you're giving up, but because you're being honest about what's actually possible. And permission to keep some aspirations in that liminal space, neither fully pursuing nor fully releasing while you figure out what's actually yours to change and what requires acceptance you're not ready for. The gap between aspiration and action isn't always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's information about your psyche. Sometimes it's information about your circumstances. Sometimes it's both. Your job isn't to close the gap through sheer force of will. Your job is to get honest about what the gap is actually telling you and respond to that information with both compassion and clear-sightedness. At midlife, especially right now, you don't need more productivity frameworks. You need the capacity to distinguish between what's yours to change, what's yours to grieve, and what's yours to keep holding loosely while you figure out what comes next. If this resonated with you, I'm glad you're here. I release videos every Monday, Wednesday, and mostly on Fridays too at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please subscribe if you want more of these conversations. They'll be here when you need them.